have the eminent historian and investigative journalist, Anton Chaitkin, who will present evidence to make the case that Benjamin Franklin, the American statesman and scientist, mentored and inspired startling advancements that transformed British industry and thereby the world. Anton, actually, we had a lovely conversation and very invigorating conversation a couple of days ago in the lead up to this. And we were discussing together with both Peters, the brilliance of the inventors and the developers of the 18th Century Lunar Society, and also the genius and compassion that was Benjamin Franklin, that together with his American circle then won the US independence. And with his protégés and heirs, they modernized their own and other countries over opposition of slave owners and over opposition of imperialists. So Anton is the author of hundreds of what he's described as scoops on economic and political history. And he's written quite a large body of startlingly original and published articles. These cause us to ask, and it certainly did for me, why didn't I learn this in school? So we're here to find that out tonight. Anton was history editor for Executive Intelligence Review from 1995 to 2015. And for 40 years, and I just made groundbreaking discoveries about the lives and intentions of those who fought for men's improvement and for their imperial opponents. We are honored and delighted that he's speaking with us, in particularly from his recent book, Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy, Volume 1, 1750s to 1850s. Welcome, Anton.
There, is that good? There we are. Thank you so much. I'm only slightly less happy to be here than I would be if I was there in person. But let's hope that happens in the summer, beautiful summer. I want to start by talking about a speech that Franklin Roosevelt gave in 1941. It's known as the Four Freedoms speech. And he said that we should have all over the world freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Freedom from want means that in every country in the world, there ought to be the fulfillment of the right to have a good standard of living for the people. And this was his vision for after World War II. I want you to keep that in mind because that's the spirit of the people whom we're going to talk about today. If we study the periods when we had rapid progress, then it should be a guide to how we might achieve some great things in our near future, especially today when we have very deep challenges in the economy and in society throughout the world. So I inquired into the Industrial Revolution, the change from backwardness to modern industrial powers that occurred in England and America. And this was a transformation that allowed society to produce a huge amount of new wealth. It gave us power to alleviate poverty and disease. Each worker became more productive and therefore more valuable as a worker. So you could pay them better. There was more wealth available from their own work to pay them more. Goods were cheaper. They were produced more cheaply, but better at the same time. Later, as we know, there were bad or even hellish conditions in some factories and in cities. I wanted to inquire into how this all happened. How did we get these powers and what happened to it? Now, there were certain improvements that took place in the middle of this transformation that were the most important changes, the most important improvements. And these happened suddenly. They didn't happen over hundreds of years. They happened in a very short number of years. So when you identify what these changes were, you can say, well, who made them? Who did these things? Because if you look up the Industrial Revolution in a book, generally it'll say that there were trends of industry or the way the population worked and various forces, but no individuals. So if you are looking into the people who are the revolutionaries who made these changes, you want to know what's their philosophy? What was their intention? What were they trying to do when they made huge changes in society through advances in science and technology and industry? The answers to these questions actually challenge our ideas of history, the history that you have heard about, and give us the chance to do beautiful things in the future. The most important changes that occurred in the Industrial Revolution at the outset were canals, steam engines, and metal machines. Later on, we had railroads and electricity. At the center of this transformation in England was the Lunar Society of Birmingham. These were talented friends. It was not a formal group ever. They met regularly, but they did things privately between them. But more than simply talented friends, they were a partnership for massive enterprises that were aimed at improving the conditions of mankind in their own country, but opening up forces that were for the betterment of humanity. When you're looking at this set of individuals, you have to contrast these Englishmen with the British East India Company, which was in those days a dominant force in the government, in the empire, and saw itself as permitted to loot and crush races and nations that were deemed inferior. Both of these intentions, that of the improvers of society and that of the looters, are great forces in the world. One of them, you could say, is a small force. The other one is a big force. The East India Company had 300,000 men in its own army of the company. But nevertheless, it was the improvers who made the great changes that gave us modern civilization. So could you put on Benjamin Franklin for the picture? There he is. This is a picture of him in 1767, I believe, when he was in England. He's at the heart of this story. He was the American, or an American representative from the colony of Pennsylvania in England. He lived in England for the better part of 18 years. He arrived in 1757. And I want to introduce first his English friends and go through what they were famous for. Start with Matthew Boulton and James Watt, who together had a great enterprise to develop the world's first steam engine. Then we have Josiah Wedgwood. He's known for his beautiful pottery, dishes, porcelains, and also, could you put on the medallion, the anti-slavery medallion? He was known as a passionate anti-slavery activist. It says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And it may be difficult for people today to put their minds around someone who is for the development of industry and science to increase power over nature, and at the same time, a passionate fighter for the human rights. And those two things go together very strongly. The anti-slavery idea gives you our first clue to the intentions of not only Wedgwood, but the whole group. Then you have Erasmus Darwin. He is the grandfather of Charles Darwin. He's a member of this group. And you have to carefully contrast him with his grandson. We'll do that in a little bit. But he was known as a jolly physician. He wrote verses about botany, very good things, but there was a lot more deep and very pro-human philosophy, and we'll get to that. Then you have Joseph Priestley, famous as he had two careers, actually. First, he was a fighter for the freedom of worship, contested with the Church of England for the right to worship in an alternate way, and for political freedom. And then he became a scientist. And he's known more in our day and later on for his science. He investigated the cycle of life, how the gases that are used in respiration, the residue that goes off and allows plants to produce sugar using sunlight, photosynthesis. He's the discoverer of that whole cycle by his investigations in chemistry and with the plants. We'll get back to him. John Wilkinson is another key member here. He was a pioneer of English modern iron making. He made a famous iron bridge. He was also known as the great developer of cannons, artillery for British forces. He developed a machine to turn a solid mass, a round iron piece, and bore it with a boring machine that the cannon was turning, and it made a beautiful hole that the shell could go into. So this is what he's famous for. None of this sounds like improvements exactly, does it? But we'll get back to all these people. I'm going to go through 4 world-shaping accomplishments of the Lunar Society: canals, steam power, revolutionary science, and aiding the American Revolution. And their role in all of these things was pretty spectacular. So Benjamin Franklin, when he came to England in 1757, he was already probably the world's most famous scientist. Came to Birmingham in 1758 and had been introduced by a scientist, a colleague of his, to Matthew Boulton, who had a button and buckle factory. And Franklin and Boulton began doing joint experiments right away in electricity and other science. And it was really Franklin and his people who were working really for him who brought the whole lunar circle, what I call the Franklin circle, together. He lived most of the time in London, but he visited Birmingham, but his correspondence and his work with these people, not only in Birmingham, but with some of them in London, really held the whole thing together. The first project of this circle was the Bridgewater Canal. This was organized by two of Boulton's friends, John Gilbert, who'd been an apprentice of Boulton's father. No, don't put that one on yet. Leave that off yet. We'll come back to that in a second. So they convinced the young Duke of Bridgewater to build a canal from inside a mountain that had his coal mine out the side and over 10 miles over to the city, the little town of Manchester. And this allowed them to bring cheap coal to Manchester and make it overnight into an industrial city. It was done to develop the area and the country, and as a model. There were spectacular ideas of improvement involved, and the price of coal was strictly limited, and the manure was carried for free for the farmers on the canal and so forth. Okay, now you can put this other map on. When the Manchester Canal, the small 10-mile canal, was finished, the Lunar Society, as a partnership, extended the canal, that canal, over to Liverpool, which is a port on the Atlantic, or I guess on the Irish Sea. And then they built a great canal across England, from Liverpool over to Hull, which is on the North Sea, right? Or yeah, that's the North Sea. They built another canal down to London and from London over to Bristol, connecting the two sides of the island down there as well. And this was the beginning. Their work as a small group of people pulling all the funds in to do this, getting acts through Parliament. This set off a train of events of an investment, which was referred to as the Canal Mania. And England was soon crisscrossed with canals. These were the first canals on ground, not simply an improvement of a river. Happened overnight. This allowed for cheap products to go to consumers and raw materials, cheap raw materials to go to factories. And all new industries became possible because of these canals. The partners were Josiah Wedgwood, the two Gilbert brothers who had worked on who had gotten the Bridgewater Canal going, Erasmus Darwin, Boulton, and Wedgwood's partner in the pottery works, named Thomas Bentley, who was an avid follower of Benjamin Franklin, an abolitionist, and a strong supporter of the American colonies. So how did the STEAM project happen. Benjamin Franklin had gone back for a year or so to America, and he came back to England in 1764, and he brought with him his collaborator from who was a science teacher in Virginia, a Scot named William Small, brilliant man, the teacher of Thomas Jefferson, and a string quartet player. And he was introduced to Bolton and immediately was made the manager of Bolton's works. Now you can put on the Soho picture. This was the factory set up. This building was made in, I think, 1766. But right then, and as soon as Small got working with Bolton, they began the great enterprise that this factory was all about, which was the development of the world's first practical steam engine. They hired James Watt from Scotland, who came down and lived with them in Birmingham. William Small, Franklin's man, was the manager of the project and the personal manager of James Watt. There were good conditions in this factory. Workers were well treated. And it was a model for people coming from all over the world to see what England was doing. They didn't make a lot of money on this for many, many years, but they were changing the world. Benjamin Franklin was the science advisor. He gave a famous talk to the Parliament demanding they stop a vicious tax called the Stamp Act against the colonies. But right after that, he is giving advice. We have a letter from him to Bolton saying that you need to recycle the smoke that comes out of the steam boiler, the cooker there, and put it back into be consumed, because smoke is fuel. And this is a key scientific consideration. So here we have Franklin helping England, Britain, to develop at the same time as he's defending American rights against the British Empire. Is that a paradox? We see this all the way through this kind of thinking from then all the way into the 20th century by the greatest leaders who were trying to advance mankind, that they're looking out for their own country as nationalists, and they're looking out for mankind as the friends of people throughout the world. To get the intentions, I'm going to read you just a tiny little bit of a letter from Wedgwood to his partner Thomas Bentley, saying perhaps, and this is about, they're talking about their pottery manufacturing, which was world famous. Perhaps we should not fearfully guard our inventions, which is based on mere money getting. Perhaps we should instead, and I'll quote this, we should instead make all good, fine, and new things we can immediately. And so far from being afraid of other people getting our patterns, we should glory in it, throw out all the hints we can, and if possible, have all the artists in Europe working after our models. This would be noble and would suit both our dispositions and sentiments much better than all the narrow, mercenary, selfish coats of armor we put on our reluctant hearts that prevent all benevolent overflowings for the good of their fellow citizens. The steam engine needed one more great advance to work. And this was that Wilkinson, the iron maker, used his boring machine to make a perfectly fitting cylinder so that the piston inside the steam engine, inside the cylinder, could operate without any leakage of the steam, of the pressure. Then it worked Wilkinson used the new steam engine to operate his iron and steel manufacturing. Wedgwood used the steam engine for his pottery manufacturing, and they went jointly into the manufacture of other metals. All kinds of industries all of a sudden opened up in England. Note that the canals, the project to build England's canals, and the project to develop the first practical steam engine occurred simultaneously, beginning together in 1765. Now I want to say something about revolutionary science. Priestley, as we saw, he was a reformer, and he became a scientist. Benjamin Franklin met him I think in London, and said, well, it's wonderful that you want to look out for the rights of worshipers and criticize government corruption, but I know you're fascinated by science. I think you might benefit mankind more by becoming a great scientist yourself. And he was the mentor to Priestley. The first great work Priestley did in this field was to inquire into the history of electrical science. He wrote a book in 1767 on that subject, and this was the standard work on the history of electricity for 100 years. He went into experiments with Wedgwood and Darwin. And you should keep in mind that some of the theories that he developed, became outmoded when Lavoisier, the French scientist, developed the science of combustion and took his ideas and named oxygen. But it was actually Priestley who brought this material to Lavoisier in France and initiated this entire science. Then you have Darwin, Erasmus Darwin. He wrote a beautiful book called Zoonomia, the science of zoology, full of optimism. He said in there that the earth is of great age, millions and millions of years, that nature was created with a built-in mechanism of improvement. He called it a filament. We might today refer to it as DNA. But that nature had in it the impulse of improvement that was given it by the Creator when animality was bestowed upon inanimate objects, and that there is therefore reason in nature. Now, this is really a very astute looking at the history of life on the earth. It has really the opposite intention from what was made out of his grandson's work by people like Huxley, Spencer, and others, and which was very pessimistic. Malthus, who was an East India Company employee, when he was a teacher, said that the world was overpopulated, that there's not enough resources, that man is basically doomed to poverty and shortage, and the best thing to do would be to kill the poor. So you have to contrast these 2 points of view between the grandfather and the grandson. The grandson did very good work as far as it went, but you have to think about the intention of the circle that he was in and his own intentions. Then we have the American Revolution, which began in 1775. Franklin was forced out of England. He might have been lynched or jailed or whatever. In the Revolution, Franklin was one of the central leaders of the secret committees of the Congress. He and George Washington were the two principal leaders of the American Revolutionary War. Franklin was in France to get allies, to get funding for the revolution, and to procure armaments. And this is where the Lunar Society came in. He coordinated from France a Lunar Society arms project. John Wilkinson and his brother William, who's a protege of Priestley, set up in France a forge, a foundry, to make artillery, to make cannons. And this was the greatest cannon manufactory in France, and the most modern forge. They did this during the time when France was at war with England, and France was a partner of the American Revolution against the British Empire. These are Englishmen setting this up. They had a cover story for carrying this out during the war. They were supplying the city of Paris with a new waterworks. So the Wilkinsons exported pipes and a Boulton and Watt engine to pump the Paris waterworks. And this was an excuse for what they were doing over there in France during this Great War. That whole project was supervised and greatly funded by Beaumarchais, the pro-American French writer who was the author of Figaro. The cannons that they produced in this forge supplied the French fleet that was the great decider in the Battle of Yorktown that won the American Revolution. Let's put on the slide of the East India Company. This is the headquarters, called the India House. Is the headquarters for the East India Company. When the British Empire lost the American War, lost the colonies, a new regime came in to England, where the East India Company's chief strategist, Lord Shelburne, was the Prime Minister of England for a brief time. He negotiated with the Americans, but he brought in a new, to end the war, but he brought in a new strategy. You can't use force to keep the empire, only force. The new strategy was, we must prevent the spread of the new productive powers that we see developing in England. No other country can be permitted to get these powers. The slogan that they adopted was free trade. And that means that no country is allowed to protect themselves from cheap imports made by cheap labor in other countries. So this is a real paradox, because here you have the power to make wages go up because each worker is more valuable. But your whole theory of trade is to overcome other countries' resistance by flooding them with goods made with cheap labor. At that time, the United Kingdom had very strict regulations on trade and high tariffs itself, which they'd had since Queen Elizabeth I. So again, this is a paradox. Do as we say, not as we do. Put on the next slide, Constitution. This is a picture of the signing of the American Constitution, 1787. Franklin went back to America. He's pictured there on the left with the curly side hair there and the glasses. After the American Revolution, Franklin went back to Pennsylvania and he became the governor of Pennsylvania. He was called the president of Pennsylvania. And he was the host for the Constitutional Convention there in Philadelphia. They're making a plan for a new government. Just before that convention opened, there was a meeting at Benjamin Franklin's house. And there, the principal leaders of the delegates approved a plan for the economic progress of the country. It was nationalist economics and a way to outflank or overcome the imperial pressure. And this plan for tariffs and for industrial progress was made up into a pamphlet and distributed to all the delegates. And it was Franklin's immediate circle who wrote the Constitution. And I go through that in detail in the book, Who We Are. Then you have Alexander Hamilton, who played an important role in this convention. He was the Treasury Secretary for first President George Washington, but his founding program to advance manufacturing in the United States, as England had done, was aborted. It was blocked by the intervention of Thomas Jefferson, who had changed sides from his earlier strong opposition to slavery over to the side that said, well, we need to protect Southern interests. And if you develop manufacturing, what will happen to the plantations? He had been in France and much involved with Lord Shelburne's friends there. I want to give you the two sides here so you see again the intentions. Hamilton said, to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is how the wealth of a nation may be promoted. Jefferson wrote in his book, The Notes on the State of Virginia, he wrote, let us never wish to see our citizens occupied at a workbench. For manufacture, let our workshops remain in Europe. America shouldn't be permitted to have manufacturing. And he said that people who labor in the earth are the best people and are the happiest people. Well, he had 600 slaves, so I'm not sure that was an honest assessment of the situation. In the 1820s, then, this is a later generation, the founding program was revived by the heirs of Benjamin Franklin, people who were very closely connected to him and to the American Revolution in their family and in their personal life. And they developed the system of national canals all the way out to the Great Lakes and the Mississippi. They, in a very short time, developed the coal and iron industries. The US Army had a school at West Point to train civil engineers, and it was American Army engineers who designed the first railroads in America. At every step of the way for this industrialization program that started in the 1820s, the slave owners fought the program. And they wanted to keep their place in the imperial hierarchy. They were by this time, exporting masses of cotton to England, and they imported goods from England. The Civil War, finally, in the 1860s, freed the United States from this imperial system. Very soon, electricity, petroleum, and mass steel production, along with great railroads, all of these are projects based on the same intentions as those of the Lunar Society. the United States aided Germany, Russia, and Japan to modernize. Americans organized the first railroad in Germany in the 1830s and built the first railroad in Russia in the 1840s. So let's go back now to finish this by looking at Franklin Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech. These advancements of industry have given us the powers over nature that allow us to produce and solve problems. It gives us the power to supply mankind with a very good standard of living all over the world. This is the fundamental human right, along with the other rights, which in my view are not doing too well in the world today. It's based on an idea of friendly cooperation between all the nations, with the at the heart of it, the idea that you'll be excited, especially young people will be very excited about participating in improvements that rapidly change the condition of man for the better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anton. Normally, we would just launch straight into questions, but I think Anton certainly does deserve, whether by reactions or by your using the old-fashioned way, a round of applause for that very stimulating discussion. Thank you so much for that stimulating presentation, Anton. Very much appreciated. So, Anton, as you can well imagine, we've had quite a few questions coming through on the chat, and I am definitely going to address some of those, and of course take questions from the audience as well. I think what really came through for me, one, is that global development is nothing new. It's something that we as a matter of course, in the way that we are as a species, development is nothing new. The manner in which we go about doing it is sometimes very suspect. Whether we engage in supporting fundamental human rights or not, and the understanding of that, and certainly a lot of what you spoke about, we saw the paradox between the way that you put it, the improvers of society and the looters of society, sometimes being one and the same individual. And what was really interesting as well was how we've come from the use of the canals and the importance of the canals and work and water in that regard, to railroads, and even to where we are today with that digital transformation and the fourth industrial revolution. I mean, and what I also found quite interesting was that paradox between the way that workers were treated through the small and Bolton factory, the Soho factory, and of course the paradox with what was happening in the world at the time in relation to slavery. And I think Councillor Jackie put it really, really well when she said that it was paradoxical that workers were treated well at the foot of slavery. And that whole idea of the moving from an agrarian economy to that industrial economy, when even within the colonies themselves, there was still that agrarian element. And of course, climate change. I mean, that whole idea of the recycling of smoke as one of, and that's actually one of the modern day methods that we are using to, which results in carbon capture to help reduce climate change. So that was definitely, as which is a phrase that was coined by our Vice Chair, Peter Bartolo, Heritage for the Future. That was literally that in action there. So, I mean, I was very excited about this talk. And one of the reasons why I was so excited was because I'm an amateur historian. And growing up in the Caribbean, I had the privilege of learning Caribbean history, American history, African history, West Indian history. And in and amongst that, that was when I first heard of the Lunar Society. I was 11 years old, and my grandfather actually gifted me a pamphlet with that medallion that was done by Josiah Wedgwood, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? So I became very interested in that, and I can't believe that I'm here now today as the chair of the Lunar Society in that regard. But I think one of the interesting things, just if we start on that premise, you raised, Anton, was around the East India Company. And that was something that I learned about in history in the Caribbean, but I don't think many people knew of it. It's a part of British history, which is much less well known. And Sandy Taylor actually pointed that out, as did a number of other people in the chat, that it was quite clear that the company enhanced and legitimized exploitation. Do you care to just elaborate a bit more on the East India Company and its impact on global development at the time?
Yes. East India Company was started in the early 1600s, and together with other institutions in the City of London financial district, and they were in a war to conquer India and to subdue China at the same time. Their power and their malevolence for the people of India in particular was a great point of resentment in the colonies. The people have heard of the Boston Tea Party. That was against an East India Company shipment, and they were very pointedly opposed to the monopoly that the government was giving to the East India Company and to what they were doing to India. They heard about. They were very well versed in America about what was going on there. I have to say also that the colonies, the best leaders in the colonies, led them to demand an end to slavery well before the American Revolution, and the King and the Privy Council repeatedly refused to allow them to abolish slavery. Of course, there were two sides. There were slave owners in America as well, but this was an imperial institution. You have to understand that. And when you go into India or Africa and you have an imperial enterprise, you are looting the place without developing the real resources of the place. You're taking some wealth out of there, but it's in the form of the virtual or actual slave labor, the bodies of the people, and you are exhausting resources. So it's not it can never be a permanent system. It's something that will definitely collapse, just like slavery in the United States would have eventually collapsed unless the whole society were destroyed. I think Karl Marx was mistaken, and some others had this point of view, when he said that the East India Company was introducing Western ways into India. That's true in certain respects, the English language, but they were not allowing India to develop industry. And so is it a right of each portion of mankind to develop scientific powers? Those who say that it's more natural for certain people to have a more primitive lifestyle or have their own lifestyle that doesn't include science or industry, go back to the history of each of the parts of mankind: India, China, Egypt, Africa. Go down to Central America. In ancient times, they had astronomy, they had mining, they had cities. So there's always these two types of intentions within a society for improvement and the right of every person to participate in great advancements in knowledge and understanding the universe, versus others who want to have war with their neighbors and basically steal what's already been created. Those two intentions are, there's a fight going on all the time between those two sides everywhere in the world.
No, thank you, Anton. No, you're absolutely right there. I think that there's that tension between, like you've said before, the improvers of society and the looters of society. And I reflect on the way that actually the Caribbean decided that they would no longer have the Privy Council as the last court of resort. And they then brought forward the Caribbean Courts of Justice as that last final appeal court. And I think that was that stamp on ensuring that from that perspective, imperialism was not being forwarded within the Caribbean. So absolutely. So we've had some further very interesting questions. And I think Atif Ali, you have a question around the extent of religious views on individuals. Did you want to ask your question of Anton?
Yes, please. Just give me a second. I'll put my camera on. I was just trying to save some. So I guess my question is, to what extent do the religious views of the individuals that you've spoken about today play a part in kind of what they led going forward? Have I frozen?
You have slightly.
Out, but I get the question. I saw it on the chat. This is very important. And again, this is something that you have to, if you want to really understand these people, and really anyone who has made astounding advancements for mankind in the past, you have to be willing to give up thinking about those people strictly in terms of what you see around you today for how people think. They're not like too many people today. There's a spark there that is still survives, but their religious views were, I would say, the best classic model for the way they thought was Erasmus in Holland during the Renaissance, who was opposed to the religious wars. He was a Catholic. He didn't go over to become a Protestant, but he criticized the corruption of the Catholic Church, but stayed a Catholic. But the important thing for him and for all of these people was that the idea of Christianity is the dignity and divinity of each human being. And that they really all were Christians in that sense. I think each and every one of them was somehow distanced from religious conformity, but at the same time, they were passionate Christians. And Franklin at the Constitutional Convention, when they were doing rancorous debates, and I think some of the Southerners were going off track, Franklin got up and said, I think we're going to have to open every meeting with a prayer. We have to understand that we've been given a gift by God to have this very convention. We got it by the skin of our teeth. And he was not known as a conformist to churches. So all of them had this idea of the divine that is in the human soul. and that when that is violated, you burn with a sense of injustice. You have this very much in Lincoln. He had this same idea of the divinity from God that's in each human being. And of course, this is for freedom of worship. Freedom of worship always means respect for someone else's type of worship. And that's something that is really a key to civilization, isn't it? We lost that when we had the religious wars of the Middle Ages and other times, and I fear we tend to lose that today.
Thank you for that question, Atif, and thank you, Anton. So, Anton, we're living in a world where we're facing huge climate challenges. And at the very beginning, you spoke about the 4 freedoms. And you said that those, it gives people powers over nature. Given that huge climate challenge that we're facing, do those freedoms still apply, or do they need to be changed?
There is a negative aspect in this question that was introduced by the East India Company in India, and they said that India is overpopulated. People die because they don't have enough food, so there should be less Indians. So let us conserve India, not wildlife, but the nature of India by not having them involved with factories. And this was notorious hypocrisy and lying, because the conditions, environmental and otherwise, were seriously degraded by the activities of these invaders. What happened in England when the canals allowed the coal that was on deposit in England to be freely distributed, so that now you could actually make iron and steel anywhere in the country. You didn't have to be next to a local stand of trees. The introduction of cheap coal allowed the island to stop tearing down the trees of England and Scotland, which was they saved that aspect of the environment by doing so. Coal has much more energy per cubic centimeter than trees do. The same thing for petroleum. If you go on in this scale, you go up to uranium for nuclear energy. You go further to fusion power in the future, and other forms of energy production in nature's limitless resources. All these resources are introduced by the ingenuity and discoveries of man. We go beyond simply having trees that we need to consume for fuel. So in the future, as we develop nuclear fission and nuclear fusion, and we develop the resources that are available on this and other planets, we have limitless energy and limitless resources in the world. To say that, as some people suggest, that the way to solve pollution and environmental problems is to scale back the living standards of the population is if you look at the history of this question for centuries, this is an excuse by empires, this question of resources and the use of them, an excuse for the mistreatment and even slaughter of the poor people. What we have to do is have an increase in the powers of our science and industry. For example, I mean, one glaringly obvious thing is, if you want to have a modern city, you can't have cars choking the streets.
Mhm.
You don't solve this by simply banning cars. You have to have a modern transportation system. America, unfortunately, is one of the most backward countries in this way. We have the ability to connect the whole world with very high-speed trains, maglev and other trains, and the ability to make new cities that provide transportation that is very, very cheap or free, like we made roads in the past. This would increase the wealth of society immensely. The more generous you are in investing in these things, the more you're able to solve problems and the more wealth and freedom you give to people. But don't give up science and the acquisition of new resources that can replace things you don't want to use anymore for one reason or another. Coal and oil are very valuable as chemicals for making materials. Wood is very valuable for other things than burning it, obviously. So this is the way to go. Increase man's powers over nature to solve these problems.
Thank you very much, Anton. That's so clear. So thank you. I think Mustaq Mirza, you've raised your hand. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I got a question. I said, thank you, Anton. But I think this was the pioneer in history, this Lunar Society, the fathers of it. My question is, their aim and intention was honorable. What would they do right now if there was alive, all those people, pandemic going on, and obesity from whole wide world is at the moment, and we are having 100 years ago, we start doing fast food. And now we're making a medicine to people not to take the food. So I wonder, I'm asking you, what would the fathers would have done now? What kind of scientists and the pioneer would have they do it in this century?
I think that an unhealthy nutrition is an effect of a poor living standard and a poor community in general, and in many respects, a collapsing society that is not moving in the right direction. If you build the kind of cities we need to do, if you have the same kind of improvement as we had at our best, I'm pretty good at the history in America of these improvements. The improvements happened in other countries as well, but we built cities, we planned cities, we had great improvements in people's ability to get good food and so forth. We had good education, introduced public education. Supposing you had projects that were for developing high-speed rail between some of the countries in South Asia and the Middle East and Russia and China and Europe and Africa. Supposing these projects also involved the building of science cities. Supposing young people from these countries, including a country like Iran, were involved. Would they want to be in some terrorist group to like ISIS to destroy society? No. They would be excited about the prospects for doing something important that satisfied their curiosity, their sense of adventure. And if you have people with a very good standard of living and with good education, they generally don't get fat. They generally don't eat horrible food. You know, we used to have a joke when I lived in New York City. We had a mayor named John Lindsay who was a banker, and he would comment on how, you know, it would be commented on him on how slim and elegant he was. He wasn't fat like some of the poor people. Well, yeah, he could eat lobster, and he had personal trainers and so forth. So it's really a matter of the standard of living. Think about a high-speed train that is very, very cheap in terms of what it does, mass produced, so it's cheap to produce it, the train itself, and it gives you cheap freight because it's very fast, and it's modern, and there's no congestion. So you get a throughput. You can bring fresh food from a distance to everybody's market, to everybody's table. It becomes within the reach of the common person to have very interesting food as well. They also need to have a good job that gives them a little bit of leisure so they can cook. You can't be terribly poor and have a good diet.
Yeah, you can smell the food as well while you're cooking.
That's right. That's right.
Absolutely. Well, I can't speak for everybody else, but I certainly have interest in food. And I don't know what it does for my waistline. Our Vice Chair, Peter Borg-Bartolo, has a question around other radicals behind the American Revolution. I wonder, Peter, if you would like to ask your question. Oh, you're on mute, Peter. Sorry. Is
that okay now? Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry about that. But Anton, thanks for this brilliant exposition. It's an amazing link in timelines, in the global effect of everything that we do in effect. But the question I've got is, apart from the lead that the Lunar Society gave to Benjamin Franklin, and you've told us a lot about that, who were the other radicals behind the American Revolution? I'm taking us a bit on a limb, I suppose, but if you can help us with that, please.
Are you talking about? Well, there's two. You can look at it two ways: inside America and in other countries. There's an important a group of leaders and countries in support of the Americans. There was something called the League of Armed Neutrality. That was headed up by Russia, by the Empress Catherine the Great, and they resisted Britain's request for them to come in the war on the side of Britain against the colonists, and they made a pact with other European countries to defend their right to and to arm their ships to allow them to trade with whomever they want, including France and America. They didn't get involved in the war, but they were very friendly to the Americans. Franklin had already established through scientific work relations with the best scientists and the greatest thinkers in Russia and in Italy and other countries. Within the United States, the real birthplace of the revolution was in Massachusetts, where they had the heritage of the Puritans, who had been Englishmen coming over to America, and they were mostly concerned with developing a new society that would be something that the world could benefit from. They were very, very conscious of this. Franklin was from Massachusetts and was in the tradition of Cotton Mather, who wrote a book called Essays to Do Good. Now, John Adams and Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty were prominently in Massachusetts. They were also in Virginia. In Virginia, there was a leader there who was the partner of William Small down in Virginia. This man was a great man in American history named George Wythe, W-Y-T-H-E. He wrote the rules for the Constitutional Convention. He was a law teacher and a profound scholar and a Greek teacher. Platonist, and he taught his law students about the morality and tragedies of the Greeks. He was profoundly anti-slavery, and he was the teacher of Jefferson. Unfortunately, Jefferson strayed from that way of thinking, but also of Henry Clay. He was Henry Clay's most like a stepfather in a way. And so he was a profound influence in the revolution and for many, many years afterwards. There was, in each place, you had the two factions. In Virginia, this was greatly pronounced. George Washington inherited slaves in his family, but he was a believer, strong believer from his family background in the development of a different society than the plantation society. He was fighting to get a westward settlement and the industrialization and profound science taught in America to make it a different place than the slave economy that was inherited, especially in that section of the country. George Washington, as he became president, was hated by many of the leaders of Virginia, who were a clique of Southern oligarchs who saw themselves as patterned on the almost feudal aristocrats, that were still active in England even after industrialization there. So you had these two sides operating. Some of the people who were of less than the noblest improvement intentions joined the revolution for one reason or another. Many people were not for the revolution in America, and you can't denigrate them and call them evil. There was a split there. But the leaders of the revolution, the spark plugs, the people who changed opinion, who wrote and led the Sons of Liberty and other movements and led the army, were profound believers in the rights of all human beings. They were deeply involved in the struggle of Ireland for freedom from England. Franklin was a leader from behind the scenes of the organization of Irish resistance to the British trade laws in the 1780s that sparked, that's my chapter 2 in this book, that sparked a revolt in Ireland. So those people in America who really led the American Revolution had a view for universal progress for mankind. And they were deeply excited about the prospects for the simultaneous development of the entire world. This went on repeatedly in our history up through the two great leaders in our century, in the 20th century, Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy, who studied the American Revolution themselves, were great historians themselves. Roosevelt was the best historian of his time. And they based their thinking on this point of view of universal progress.
Tony, who were the leaders of the anti-slavery society in New York in the 1790s?
Well, Hamilton.
Yes. And who else?
Hamilton, and he was also, of course, the proposer of industrialization. His family started the Erie Canal. His father-in-law actually started building it as a private enterprise. Hamilton was from the West Indies and was taught by a furious preacher who was for universal human rights, and taught. Hamilton had the idea of that the rich had better watch out about God's wrath and if they treat the poor in a bad way. He saw the evils of slavery from the Caribbean. He was sometimes snubbed by the betters, so-called, in the U.S. And in the colony, in the colonial world, because he was from, he was an immigrant. His parents, I don't believe, were married, and he was a genius who had this point of view of excitement, that we can use compassion as the way of developing the whole planet. he helped Toussaint Louverture in Haiti to develop his movement for freedom of the Black people there who were French slaves. The sugar plantations were the most terrible, really, of all in the treatment of the people, the huge death rate. And this was part of the resentment against Hamilton by this clique in Virginia and South Carolina, that he was for the powers of the central government that could uplift the entire population. And these leading slave owners thought that if the central government had these powers, then surely they would abolish slavery. The plan of Hamilton, he was a founder of an abolition society, a manumission society. But more important than that at the time was the program to industrialize the country. Because if you do that, according to the founding program of Franklin, Hamilton, Washington, then you will make slavery, you'll make it fall apart, because you have the prospect for very profitable investment in skilled manufacturing that would make obsolete these less profitable investments in slaveholding and plantations. Remember that the objective of a slave owner was more about status. Money was in a sense a secondary, but it was important. The slaves were valuable, but you could make more money in industry. And they said, if you develop industry and build railroads and connect the South to a modernizing society, we're going to lose our place in that society. We will not have the power over other human beings. That's the real issue. It's the same thing as in Africa. When the British and the French and the Dutch, the Portuguese and the Spanish went into Africa, they allowed the worst elements in their society to loot those countries. They brought out some raw materials. They brought out human beings as they were kidnapped as slaves, but they did not develop really the most valuable resources of Africa. Are diamonds and gold the most valuable resource? Ridiculous. Or oil? No. How about iron? How about the other metals? How about the vast agricultural potential, which modern agriculture, together with science, could feed the entire world? But the industries of Africa were not developed by the imperialists, because to do so meant you were developing powerful societies with many people in them who were skilled and independent, and they would have political power to outvote you in the world. You would lose your power over them. You would lose your power as an empire. So it's not so much just money as it is power of a few over many. That's the issue for them.
Thank you, Anton. I think that's still an issue today, frankly. We're going to take one last question from Clive Stone, and then we'll just come to you, Anton, for your closing remarks and reflections.
Thank you. Anton, this has just been unbelievably superb. The chat forum has been huge. I only have about 100 questions, so I'll keep it down to one. All right. With one comment. Power over nature, yes, but we seem to have lost respect for it at the same time. And without respect, then we're going to end up in a situation where we have more situations like we are now in pandemic. Anyway, my question is the paradox. You've mentioned individuals like Kennedy, like Roosevelt. I can think of Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, all people who are at the very high levels of what we would like this world leaders
Right.
and thinkers to be. With the current environment of social media, the leaders tend to be people like Trump, like ISIS, because they can easily speak fake news. That is a paradox to me, and I really would love to have your thoughts on it.
Go back to Nelson Mandela and Gandhi. Mandela was actually inspired by an agreement made between Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill called the Atlantic Charter. Churchill later tried to renege on it, but it stated this is at the outset of World War II. America was backing Britain against Hitler, but wasn't yet in the war. And the Atlantic Charter that they both signed said that everyone in the world should be allowed to govern themselves. And of course, that included people who had been conquered by the British and other colonial powers, and not just those countries conquered by Hitler. Churchill didn't like that, but signed it because you had this alliance that was really necessary. But this prospect for the development of these societies, independent development, was very, very exciting. Kennedy raised the same kind of issues when he was a senator before he was president. He was a champion of African and Arab national independence movements. And then he came into power as president. The first person to come to his White House to visit him as a foreign head of state was Kwame Nkrumah, president and liberator of Ghana. And they worked out an arrangement to develop a great dam in Ghana on the Volta River for the purpose of providing electricity to allow for the industrialization of West Africa. At the same time, there was a royal institution set up by the British and Dutch royal families called the World Wildlife Foundation, or World Wildlife Fund. And they countered Kennedy by saying that the crisis in Africa is not poverty. The crisis in Africa is that the wildlife are being displaced. So don't mess with the system in Africa. You can't avoid looking with dismay at the lack of compassion that we have in our society. I'm talking about US and Britain and a lot of Europe. The lack of compassion for the situation facing the poor in the world. It's not something where you say, well, I have a range of options and let's figure things out without reference to the realities there. Do people have the right to a decent existence? Okay, can they do that? Can they get a decent existence without vast power to produce and to solve scientific problems? No, they won't get it. Now look back at the intentions and the work of the people that I've been talking about. When the canals were first built in England, they were actually beautiful. They planted trees all along them. They made all of their works quite beautiful. They paid good wages. They had clean environments for the people that they supplied cottages to and so forth. In all of the backward conditions that we face over the course of these 2 centuries when we've had industrial society, there's squalor and filth accompanying poverty. Can we build modern times that lift people out of poverty and make the human environment better for them. What kind of a city, for example, is necessary to live in that's decent? Well, a city is planned, as some of our cities were, with great parks, with woodlands around, with preserving some nature that is wild. But your aim is to give man the kind of dignified existence that is their right. And I have to insist, I hope that people are with me on this. You have to start the conversation with looking with compassion at the situation facing mankind, including, for example, on other topics that are like this, the topic of refugees that have flooded into Europe from Syria and other zones of conflict. And it's one thing to be sympathetic to those refugees, but search your soul. Have we created those refugees? Have we forced them from their homes? Why do we have a war in Syria? Was that really a good idea? I don't think so. So it's definitely a paradox, because you have the atomic bomb and you have the atomic fission for power plants, and you have radiation that could be helpful for cancer and so forth. When Prometheus defied Zeus in the ancient Greek myth, he gave man the power over nature, which is fire and the arts of manufacturing. Can these be used for evil? Can these be used in a heedless way that destroys everything? Yeah, Dr. Strangelove is a real danger, right? Nuclear war and despoiling of countries. But to say that we should not look at situations consumed with compassion for these people is to be unrealistic about all of these problems, to hide your head. The people who made every advance, and I'm going to go through in my second volume, people like Edison and others, those who have made all of the great advances and the greatest scientists had in their hearts an exciting idea about the rights of man, compassion, and curiosity into how these things could be solved in new ways that people had never heard of before. Without that attitude, you can't solve any of these problems. You'll never solve the environmental problems by simply allowing those whose agenda is reducing the rights of the poor. And I think that you have to face this. This is a really big historic problem. And it is a paradox. There's no easy answer to these things. If you look at a Chinese city choked with smoke, how do you get out of that? You have to have an entirely new transportation and manufacturing system that is 21st century and beyond to solve these environmental problems. These are real terrible problems that will kill us unless we have some really deep thinking about it.
Thank you, Anton. I think you're absolutely right. You spoke about compassion and curiosity. I think that that's what excites creativity, such that we can make that meaningful difference in the world. And I am absolutely thrilled and delighted that there are so many great thinkers on this call tonight, and not just great thinkers, but people who genuinely catalyze action such that they can influence change through that compassion that you're talking about, because that's the only way that we can do this. And as a society, the Lunar Society is such that we put the challenge out there and we seek to ensure that that challenge is met. So I am really, really thrilled, and I applaud not just you, Anton, but frankly, everyone who's come onto this call tonight, so that we can consider this, discuss this, and leave here tonight actually doing something for change, for our world. So I'm going to invite you in the good old-fashioned way to applaud Anton, of course, but yourselves as well for being a part of this tonight. Thank you so much.
Get in touch with me.
Thank you so much. So Anton, I'm going to ask you, in your very honest, clearly honest and candid way, just to give us a 2-minute reflection and conclusion to tonight and what you want to see moving forward. I mean, the Lunar Society is about looking back for the future. So as I said earlier, Peter Borg Bartolo coined that phrase for us, heritage for the future. How do you see us using what you have said tonight in a meaningful way, that heritage for the future?
I would point out something that followed the 4 freedoms, Franklin Roosevelt. Towards the end of World War II, he proposed that 4 countries should work together. The great powers should work together to bring peace and development of the economy to the world. And the 4 countries were the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China. If those 4 countries would work together for that purpose of solving the problems of the world, they would be solved. No one could resist that. Now, after the war, there was a trial of the Nazis at Nuremberg, and the chief crime that came out was the fact that they started the war, gave them the cover for their genocide. The United Nations was established, and they had a charter, and they had a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in both the charter and the Human Rights Declaration, this is in the middle 40s, they declared, and the world declared, and everyone agreed to this, that the human race had the right to a decent and adequate standard of living. That was a basic human right. And so we look back at what people have fought for to accomplish the power to do that. You can't be simply compassionate. You have to really be able to alter a really rotten situation in a fundamental way. And that's what we have to consider as we look to our future. I believe we should have the same idea of cooperation, but of rapid advances in the industrial powers and scientific powers. We'll get some other time into this question of the 4th industrial, whatever it is, revolution, which is, I think, something different, because you've got to have transportation, you've got to have steel making, you've got to have schools built, you've got to have science centers for biology and medicine and really intensive energy. You've got to have the space program. These are physical and scientific advancements that are crucial for our survival. And we have a wonderful model right there where you are in looking back at these heroes from an earlier time that ought to give us inspiration now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anton. You know, I think much like many other people, I have 100 other questions. And even after as you were speaking, I could think of other questions that I wanted to ask, certainly in regard to the 4th Industrial Revolution. So in that vein, Anton, because we don't want to lose you, and you are such an incredible individual with such an illuminating mind that would only serve to engage and grow the Lunar Society. On behalf of the Executive Committee of the Lunar Society and our members, I would like to extend to you the honorary fellowship position with the Lunar Society.
Oh,
I hope you will oblige us by accepting an honorary fellow position with the Lunar Society.
thank you very much. I certainly want to encourage everybody who's listening to join the Lunar Society also, which you could do right away.
Absolutely, you can do right away.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. We're very honored and very pleased and delighted to have you, Anton. Thank you so much. So with that all being said, I think we are now coming to the close of our evening. I must thank everyone for being so wonderfully engaging tonight. And I certainly would love to, as Anton quite rightly said, we would be delighted to, he's already started recruiting members. Thank you, Anton. I feel like saying www.lunarsociety.org.uk. So, and you're most welcome to join us. Remember, we have international membership. So whether you're in the States or in Belgium, my daughter Anissa, you still need to join. Or in the Caribbean, or just down the road in Birmingham. You know, we would really love to have you. And as this forum has shown, I mean, we're able to discuss and exchange ideas. And this society genuinely is about catalyzing action. There is so much that happens as a result of these discussions. And imagine, I, as an 11-year-old girl in Grenada, heard of Josiah Wedgwood of the Lunar Society doing a little history paper, and look where I am today in Birmingham, far less for the rest of us and our children. And we owe it to our children. So please do join us. We would love to have you. You're very, 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 very welcome. Thank you. Okay, so everyone have a lovely, lovely evening and enjoy your time back to wherever it is that you're going to go to. We do have some future events coming up, which are on the screen now. So on March the 4th, we are having nuclear energy in a fossil fuel-free society, which is part of our Matthew Bolton lecture. And that we're having that lecture by our executive committee member, David Dundas. And then on March the 16th, we are hosting the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, Hustings. So we very much look forward to seeing you there if you are able to make it. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Deirdre, for chairing.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anton. Thank you very much.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.